The current Washington Redskins football franchise actually started out in Boston. In 1932, the mostly Midwestern game, football, and its top league, the NFL, were looking to expand to the entire country. So they started setting up franchises on the East Coast. They found a spot in Boston, Massachusetts. Braves Field, home of National League Baseball's Boston Braves, was willing to host an NFL franchise. So the National Football League awarded George Preston Marshall, a Washington, D.C. businessman and a longtime fan of football, the team in Boston. As was very common practice at the time, the new NFL franchise would share the name with the baseball franchise that it was sharing a stadium with. Football did not have much popularity and was attempting to grow. The NFL believed that it could take some of the brand loyalty and notoriety by taking the name of the baseball team in that place. If somebody is already a fan of the New York Giants baseball team, now you're already a New York Giants fan. You're just a New York Giants fan of two sports. Kind of like how college works. So 1932, Boston Braves NFL franchise began. The relationship between Braves Field and the Boston NFL franchise only lasted one season. In 1933, the Boston NFL franchise moved in to the older and smaller Fenway Park, home of American League Baseball's Boston Red Sox. Now that the Boston Braves were no longer playing at Braves Field, the franchise no longer wanted to keep the name Braves. However, the franchise was extremely low on funds, so changing logos, uniforms, costumes, and branding was not an option. The franchise wanted to find a name that would keep the Native American theme, but also accord well with Fenway Park and their new roommates, the Boston Red Sox. Did such a name exist? After researching the names of other professional sports teams and collegiate sports teams across the country, they found a collegiate team with a name that might be the solution to their problem. Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Their sports teams all have the name Redskins. Redskins is a term for Native Americans, and it also has the word red in it. With this name, the Boston NFL franchise would be able to keep their Native American theme and not have to change logos and branding, but also having the word red in their name helps them fit in at Fenway Park and with the Boston Red Sox, and hopefully help them borrow some of the Red Sox brand recognition and fans. So it was settled. The Boston NFL franchise's new name would be the Boston Redskins. 3 years later, in 1936, the Boston Redskins had their best year. Finishing with a 7-5 record, the Boston Redskins won the Eastern Division, as well as the right to host the NFL championship game. Before the AFL merger and the Super Bowl, the NFL championship game was the final game of the NFL season. The winner of the NFL championship game would be crowned NFL champion. Team names is not the only thing that the NFL borrowed from Major League Baseball. Like Major League Baseball's World Series, the NFL championship game alternates each year. Odd years, the winner of the Eastern Division would host the NFL championship game. And on even years, the winner of the Western Division would host the NFL championship game. Though the Boston Redskins were 7-5 and Eastern Division champions, interest in the Boston Redskins in Boston was low. Attendance at games were among the league's lowest figures. The city of Boston did not show much interest in the game of football. It felt like Boston would always be a baseball town. Though the Redskins had earned the right to host the NFL championship game at their home, Fenway Park, the franchise elected to have the event in a neutral site. Redskins owner George Preston Marshall felt he could sell more tickets in New York, where people would be interested in seeing an NFL championship game, despite not having a team of their own in the game, than he could in Boston, where interest in football is very, very low. So, the 1936 NFL championship game was held in the Polo Grounds in New York, New York, and was the only neutral site NFL championship game in the 37-year history of the NFL championship game. The Redskins lost the game 21-6. That offseason, Marshall was able to convince the NFL to allow him to move his franchise to his hometown of Washington, D.C., where there had not been an NFL team before. That season, the Washington Redskins won the NFL championship in their very first year in Washington.
Turned out for the 1936 NFL championship game at the Polo Grounds in New York. The game pitted the Packers of small-town Green Bay, Wisconsin, against the Redskins of the metropolis of Boston. The Boston backfield was famous, but the passing game of Green Bay settled the score, and when the dust settled, the Packers had ground out a 21-6 victory.